All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's continue with Giotto. What made him remarkable in terms of pushing the boundary of what had been done before and in a direction more towards this naturalism I was talking about. So let me open up my slideshow for you here. I think I'm doing, let's see, I'm just double checking my screencast-o-matic view here. Let's go to that view. That sounds good to you. All right, I think you can still see me and see what we're talking about as well. All right, so I'm just giving you a little context here. We're not going to look at architecture yet. That's coming up in the next section of the Quattrocento. But this is called the Scrovegni, or the Arena Chapel. It's located in Padua, and it is a location that Giotto was hired to paint the interior of. And the Scrovegni family, I believe Signor or Mr. Scrovegni got in trouble for kind of unscrupulous money practices, sort of like a white-collar crime in his day. And so to make amends, to atone for his sins, because people actually were that religious that they actually worried that they would end up and being condemned to hell, right? That sometimes making a gift like this to the community, to a chapel like this, would hopefully earn them some bonus points in heaven, supposedly. All right, let me see if I can find my PowerPoint slide icons here and advance my slide here. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're moving into a view of the inside of the Arena Chapel in Padua here. And we're looking at the years. Finally, we're in the new century, 14th century, 1305 to 1306. And it's here that Giotto employs the technique that the ancients knew about. This is something that the Romans used abundantly. And it's the fresco method. And that's the go-to method when you're painting on a wall. If you use tempera, it would end up peeling and flaking off over time. But there's something about when you paint into a thin kind of finish coat of wet plaster. After the walls have all the plaster walls have been constructed, and some of you may live in old homes that have plaster walls like mine are. They do a finish coat, kind of a final coat that's the smoothest, prettiest coat, maybe with a little, pretty texture. And that is what Giotto would paint into. And so that the pigment, the paint, and the plaster dry at the same time, and they actually chemically fuse together, resulting in something very durable. So that is the way to go when painting on walls. So he was hired to do a whole program of murals in this chapel, on the sides, on the back wall, on the ceiling. This is a tile floor down below here. We're going to focus on one of the side panels instead of the whole thing. But as you can see from my PowerPoint, oops, moving it back a little too far, we have three themes. The top is, and I think I might have obscured the bottom row here, the top focuses on the lives of the Virgin Mary and her parents. The theme of the middle row is the scenes from the life and mission of Jesus. And on the bottom is what we're interested in, and that is about his passion and resurrection. So you might recognize a crucifixion scene right here. We're going to focus on the adjacent panel done in fresco right next to it. What happened after the crucifixion is what, again, this visual storytelling, almost reading, again, from top to bottom, left to right, almost like you read, the Sunday Funnies in the LA Times. All right, just another view of what it's like to be inside that space. Okay, let's take a look at what's called the Lamentation. The Lamentation here. And this is one of the scenes of the multiple scenes on the bottom about Christ's passion and resurrection. So whenever you see an artwork called the Lamentation, it's about the time that, Christ has been crucified, right? He's been put to death, and his loved ones and followers have removed him from the cross, removed his body from the cross, and are in grief or lament, just tremendous sorrow over what they believe is that's it. It's curtains. It's over forever. He's gone forever. The resurrection hasn't happened hasn't happened yet. But what I say to kind of tongue in cheek is that the cast includes the Virgin Mary, his mother, is there, St. John the Baptist, and another kind of famous Mary, Mary Magdalene, who you might know her story as well, who deeply loved Christ so much. And she was sort of a fallen woman, right, a prostitute who was reformed by her adoration of Jesus. Unrequited, by the way. But there are other people there as well. So what you have is an artist who's taking on a scene with a more complexity than we've ever seen before. It's got a huge cast. And I use kind of theater lingo because what you see here is he's creating kind of a stage presentation. And there were these little mini plays that would be played out in these in this Proto-Renaissance era, where before, outside of churches, people would enact scenes from the Gospels, that kind of thing, as kind of using theater to tell the stories of the Bible. So it's almost like that seems to have influenced Giotto. And you also see an artist starting to look at the natural world and incorporate real-world settings into his art as well. So making, the story of Jesus, when these events were happening supposedly here on earth, making it look like it's here on earth. So first of all, he constructs, of course, a shallow stage, meaning people aren't positioned in the middle ground or deep background. They're right before our eyes. And there's this kind of rocky hill or wall that descends that kind of contains them. It's almost like a first row seat in a small boutique playhouse or theater, right? That we're bearing witness to what's happening in this particular scene here. There's also a landscape setting. Look at that rocky hill. There's a leafless tree here, kind of symbolic of death. A blue sky. What? Where's that gold background? Where Giotto says, bye, I'm getting rid of that. Look, it's old school. I'm moving forward. I want to make my religious art more relatable, connect to real world natural contexts, and make people look like you and I. So another thing he abandons is hierarchy of scale. Everybody is the same size or to scale. And he's more adventurous with his composition. So he's not putting his most important person, which would be Jesus and probably Mary too, in the center of the composition and making them the biggest so we can find them like a bullseye on a dartboard. No, he puts them slightly off-center. Do you see Jesus yet? Have you been able to find him? You have to kind of look, but Giotto's helping us out in three different ways. The first thing you might notice is that everybody is looking in that direction. So they're looking down at Jesus, who's right here. And then Mary's head and her halo are in mirror image of one another. She's often next to him in death, right? As she is when she was a young mother. But everybody's gazing down at them. The next thing you might notice is that you have two figures whose backs face us. And that's really unusual to see in art. Usually, people, photographers, whatever, they don't like, actors. You're not supposed to turn your back to your audience, so to speak. But Giotto does this almost like two bookends, framing that scene of grief between mother and son. Okay, that's why they're there. The final thing has to do with, some of you might know this already, compositionally, that landscape element, this rocky hill. You might see how it's kind of illuminated at its top. It's a directional device. It's kind of like a pointed arm taking our eyes down directly to mother and son right here. So there's some tricks, some devices that Giotto employs to get us to look in the right places. The other thing you might notice too is he too embraces and continues this idea of the clothing describing the anatomy underneath. So you see clothing hugging arms and backs and waists, so you get a sense of believable mass and volume through careful modeling or highlights and shadows. He also makes this scene heartbreaking. He brings a kind of an unprecedented emotionalism to the scene as well that we didn't really see in those more stoic depictions of saints or Madonna enthroned. You see people with facial expressions of grief and body language, arms thrown out, hands clasped enough beneath the chin. They're upset. They're in grief. You can see that, and you can feel empathy for them. Finally, you have, or not finally, but in addition, this quality of naturalism is also convincing because he uses single source lighting, as if the sun is truly shining from the sun in the sky, and it's consistently falling on all the figures. So, for instance, their backs are illuminated, but underneath their figures are still cast in shadow. So that kind of naturalism and believability is showing you that Giotto's like going outside and looking at the natural world, looking at perhaps using real models and having them pose. They all, of course, have tremendous variety from one another, different faces, different expressions. So this kind of individualization is more progressive and more naturalistic as well. What else can I tell you? Finally, we got to look up in the sky. This is what everybody loves the most about this painting, is all of the weeping angels. And sometimes little angels in Renaissance art look like babies or toddlers, right? It's like preschool age angels. Oh, but break out your Kleenex for this poor little guy. Oh, no, this one's using his or her robe here to wipe their eyes. But this is an instance where you see an example of foreshortening used to convey depth. Foreshortening used to convey depth. So what you do, if you render something at a slight diagonal, like you see here or here, it makes the human eye believe that these angels are actually occupying airspace up in that blue sky that Giotto has created. And again, they're all in different poses and expressions of grief, so that not only are they heartbreaking in their expression of grief over the loss of Jesus, but also you believe that they're flitting and flying around that sky, that the painting, again, has a sense of dimensionality and depth that was not a priority with earlier artists, particularly in the medieval period here. So again, creating a foreground means that there's a middle ground or a background. We don't see anything quite going on in a deep background yet, but that's coming up soon in the Renaissance, you guys. So let me just check my notes here. I think that about covers what Giotto accomplished and why he is so known for bringing this kind of naturalism to proto-Renaissance art, and a relatability where holy figures look like you and I. They're in proportion. Their robes hug their bodies. We have naturalistic settings. We have lighting. We have more adventurous compositions. No more gold backdrops. No more hierarchy of scale. All of this, and again, an interest in illusionism of depth is taking us into that, further into what the naturalism in the Renaissance is really known for. Oh, by the way, all the cracks you see here aren't from earthquakes, although Italy has earthquakes like California. These are sections. Remember, when you work in fresco, you have to paint while the plaster's still wet. So he could only paint a section at a time. So you can actually see the piecemeal approach to this painting that he executed for the Arena Chapel. Pretty impressive, right? That'd be pretty hard to work in such a piecemeal fashion before the medium dried. Anyway, that's it, everybody. Moving on to other Proto-Renaissance art after this.